Welcome back to my channel. Hey guys, tonight we begin with the medieval peasant wedding, a celebration that somehow blended holy vows, livestock, drunk uncles, and the occasional fistfight into what can only be described as a deeply rustic fever dream. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. There were no invitations, no gilded parchment, no wax seals, not even an angry raven dropping scrolls on rooftops. In the medieval village, weddings spread by one method only: gossip. It usually started with a whisper at the well. Did you hear? Thomas is marrying Beatrix. A day later, it reached the baker, who told the miller, who told the midwife, who told literally everyone she passed, whether they cared or not. By nightfall, even the sheep knew someone was getting married. The priest, notably, was always the last to find out. There was no such thing as being uninvited. If you were alive and within walking distance, you went, not because you were particularly close to the couple, but because weddings meant food and drink, and maybe a fist fight if things got festive. The bride and groom didn't draw up guest lists. They had no control over who came. You could end up with 10 people or half the county. That's just how it worked. More people meant more gifts, which in peasant economics translated to possibly getting an extra chicken or sack of turnips, valuable stuff if you're living on GRL. Of course, you had to plan for guests showing up, but you also had to plan for guests not showing up. Some might be dead, some might be drunk, some might just forget. One guy was still harvesting barley and didn't notice the entire wedding happened without him. Because, let's be clear, time was flexible. Noon could mean anywhere between breakfast and sunset. There were no watches, just the sun and people's vague ability to guess how far it had moved since they last looked up from milking a cow. The bride and groom weren't fussed about seating charts or name cards. You sat wherever your behind landed, log, stone, or haystack. And if the pig had already claimed your seat, well, too bad. The pig stays. In the medieval peasant world, formal wear was more of a suggestion than a standard. Fashion in this context wasn't about trends or elegance. It was about not being naked and maybe brushing the straw out of your hair. The bride did her best. She wore her nicest dress, which, to be fair, probably wasn't white. White fabric was impractical, expensive, and a magnet for every farm animal within a 2-meter radius. Instead, she wore brown or gray or off-gray, which had once been white before 3 harvests, and a sheep-related incident happened to it. She might weave a crown from wildflowers if it was spring, or ribbon from something vaguely decorative, like an old curtain or someone's spare belt. She didn't expect to look like a queen. She just hoped to look like someone who hadn't been digging onions all morning. The groom, meanwhile, tried to look respectable. He might wash his tunic. He might comb his hair, assuming he still had some. If he had shoes, they went on. If not, barefoot it was. Calloused feet were considered rustic, not rude. And if he smelled vaguely like pig, well, so did everyone. Hygiene was relative. Soap existed, but not the kind you'd want near your eyes. Bathing was done seasonally or when it rained, so most guests didn't arrive sparkling clean. They arrived recognizably human. That was enough. Accessories were rare, but meaningful. A belt with an extra pouch. Stylish. A hat with feathers. Bold. A tooth still in place. Luxury. No one owned jewelry unless it was stolen or passed down from a great-grandmother who had once kissed a merchant. Children arrived smeared in mud, proudly displaying whatever insect or twig they'd found on the way. Old men wore the same wool cloak they wore every day. Old women wrapped in layers cast judgmental glances at everyone, muttering, "When I got married," under their breath. But no one cared if your hem was frayed or your sleeves didn't match. This wasn't a fashion show. This was a rare break from labor, a communal moment of joy. And if you arrived with both your boots and your teeth, you were practically nobility. The wedding venue was wherever there was space and fewer than 5 pigs. Ideally, it was the churchyard, not in the church that was reserved for noble weddings and high-maintenance saints. Peasants made do with what they had, which often meant exchanging vows next to a grave, under a tree, or beside a chicken coop that doubled as a bandstand. Grass was a luxury. Most of the time, the ground was either dry and cracked, or soggy and full of surprise holes. If it had rained recently, and it usually had, the entire ceremony took place on a patch of churned-up mud, generously seasoned with manure. Guests arrived wearing their wedding boots, which were just their regular boots, but with a resigned expression. There were no chairs, no bunting, no altar made from reclaimed oak. People stood or squatted or leaned against fences that creaked ominously. Sometimes someone brought a bench, and the elders claimed it immediately like royalty without a throne. Everyone else just tried not to fall into a ditch. The decorations, nature, mostly weeds. If someone hung a few flowers or ribbons around a fence post, it was considered Martha Stewart-level ambition. The rest of the setting was filled in by animals, dogs sniffing everything, chickens absolutely underfoot, and the occasional confused goat photobombing the betrothal. And then there were the smells. Pigs in the next field, sheep nearby, the faint but persistent scent of cabbage stew simmering in someone's pot. Combined with sweat and ale breath, it was less a wedding ambiance and more a medieval cologne sampler. But still, people showed up because setting didn't matter. This was a rare break from the grind of survival. The wedding could be held in a puddle surrounded by compost, and it would still be better than weeding barley all day. By the time the bride and groom stood before the priest, most of the guests were already itchy, sunburned, or 3 cups of ale into the celebration, which was fine because the ceremony itself wasn't exactly a Shakespearean affair. It was short, it was awkward, and if the priest had somewhere to be afterward, it was even shorter. For medieval peasants, marriage wasn't about flowers, rings, or tearful vows. It was mostly about contractual clarity. The church by the 12th century had begun to insist on a priest's involvement. But truth be told, many couples considered themselves married the moment they declared their consent in front of witnesses. I take you as mine, and you take me as yours. That was the gist. Romantic in a highly practical tax-liable way. Some ceremonies included a blessing and a few Latin mutterings. Most didn't involve kissing, not because of modesty, but because no one was eager to put their mouth on someone else's mouth after 6 days without soap. The priest might cross himself, say a prayer, and then rush off to his next task, like helping dig a grave or yelling at a goose. The church had range. There were no rings unless someone found a bent copper trinket or inherited a questionable family heirloom. Some couples exchanged small tokens, cloth, a knife, or a coin to seal the deal. Others just shook hands and hoped no one backed out before sundown. Consent was the key. Both parties had to agree out loud and in front of others. If the bride said nothing and looked like she might bolt, the priest technically had to delay things. But often a stern glance from a parent or a reminder of dowries already exchanged moved things along fast. And that was it. No organ music, no flower petals, no long speeches. Just two peasants standing in a muddy yard saying yes to a future of shared labor, screaming children, and if they were lucky, one good blanket. But despite the simplicity, the weight was real. In that moment, surrounded by friends, livestock, and curiosity-driven toddlers, they were bound not by lace or incense, but by words. And in the medieval world, words had power, especially when followed by ale. Now, when peasants said feast, what they meant was, we have more than one kind of food today, and nobody has to steal it. The post-wedding meal wasn't catered. There was no menu. There were no servers. There was, however, a communal pot that had been boiling for hours and contained roughly half the village's hopes and all of its root vegetables. The centerpiece of the meal was usually a stew, bubbling in a cauldron the size of a small cart. Into it went cabbage, leeks, onions, barley, turnips, maybe some dried peas, and if you were really lucky, a bit of meat, a chicken if someone had been feeling generous or reckless. Otherwise, flavor was left in the hands of salt or fate. Guests didn't sit at tables. They found a rock, a bench, or a sturdy dog. Bowls were passed around, and if you didn't bring one, you had to eat from your hands or borrow your neighbor's. Spoons were wooden, shared, or theoretical. Fingers did most of the work. Drinks were better. Ale was plentiful, home brewed, and stronger than expected. It went down fast, burned slightly, and made even burnt stew taste like joy. Water was technically an option, but most people avoided it since it often doubled as a bacteria cocktail. Ale safer and more festive. Bread, when available, was dense enough to stun a pig. It was either fresh and sour, or old and sharp enough to qualify as a weapon. Cheese made appearances too, but only if the cow had been kind that week. There were no desserts, unless someone brought berries or dried fruit, and no one trusted the berries. Still, it was abundance by peasant standards. A second bowl, a third, that was luxury. Children raced around with crusts in hand. Elders snored contentedly, gums be damned. Dogs wandered underfoot, receiving more food than usual, and less appreciation than they deserved. And despite the lack of silver platters or fancy cuts, the feast meant something. It was a chance to be full, to rest, to celebrate something other than surviving winter. Because when you live a life ruled by seasons, plows, and random plague outbreaks, any excuse to eat together and laugh loudly is a victory, even if it tastes mostly like boiled cabbage. Forget blenders and monogrammed towels. In a medieval peasant wedding, the gift registry was simple. Bring whatever you can carry, preferably alive or edible. Wedding gifts weren't about sentiment. They were about survival. Guests brought what they had: a couple of eggs, a chunk of hard cheese, a chicken tied by its feet, or in truly generous cases, a small sack of grain. These weren't presents so much as practical investments in the couple's new life together, because nothing says congratulations on your lifelong binding contract like half a dozen turnips. Occasionally, someone would arrive with something a bit more interpretive: an old hoe missing a handle, a wooden spoon with bite marks, a goat with a limp and questionable eyesight. But even that was better than arriving empty-handed. Showing up without a gift marked you as either very poor or very bold, and either way, people noticed. Money was rare. Most peasants didn't see coins often, and when they did, they tended to hoard them like dragons hoard gold. So the idea of giving money as a wedding gift was laughable. Goods, not coins, made the world go round. If someone gave the bride a jug of ale or a loaf of fresh bread, they were practically royalty. Sometimes gifts were recycled. And yes, That's as medieval as it gets. A goose given at your wedding might reappear at your cousin's wedding a year later, slightly older and angrier. There were whispers of one clay jug making the rounds for over a decade. No one remembered where it came from. No one dared keep it. But the gifts weren't just for the couple. They also played a role in community optics. Giving something useful proved you were invested in the household's success. It signaled goodwill, participation, and maybe a hope that when it was your turn to marry, someone would return the favor with a particularly plump chicken, and despite the randomness and re-gifting, there was warmth in it. These weren't luxurious things, but they were what people could spare. In a world where most had little, giving anything at all was an act of generosity, even if it squawked the whole way there. Every medieval village had its own cast of characters, and they all showed up at weddings, uninvited and impossible to miss. Think of it as a social reunion mixed with reality TV, minus the cameras and with more goats. First, there was the village loudmouth, usually an older woman who knew everyone's business and had no filter. She'd start with "Bless the happy couple" and finish with, "Though we all remember what happened last harvest behind the bakehouse." She wasn't trying to stir the pot. She was the pot. Then came the local wise woman, part healer, part witch, full-time source of rumors. She would bless the couple with a mysterious herb. No one could identify and mutter something like, "May your cows always give milk unless they don't." People nodded solemnly. No one wanted to make eye contact. You'd also spot the retired soldier who hadn't fought a battle in 30 years, but still wore part of his dented helmet and told the same story about a skirmish near France that probably didn't happen. He'd shout to the bride and groom and immediately fall over. And of course, the drunk uncle. Every village had one. Red-nosed, overly affectionate, and prone to yelling, "Love is war," while trying to dance with someone's grandmother. He'd gift a bent spoon or a suspiciously light jug of ale. Still, it was tradition. But beyond the personalities, the real engine of the wedding was gossip. Weddings were ideal breeding grounds for juicy whispers. Who showed up late? Who looked too cozy with the shepherd? Who brought a gift that looked suspiciously like the one they got last year? Nothing escaped notice. If the bride's dress had a stain, someone had an entire theory. If the groom looked pale, someone declared he'd been hexed. The talk started during the ceremony and would ripple out for weeks, woven into bread lines, passed between milk buckets, and baked into the village's collective memory. And honestly, people lived for it. Life was hard. Gossip was free. If you've ever been to a wedding where no one hired a babysitter, now imagine that. But with more mud, fewer teeth, and absolutely zero supervision. That's a medieval peasant wedding. Children were everywhere. Not politely sitting, not carefully nibbling bread. No, they were tearing through the gathering like feral squirrels on a sugar high, fueled by stolen crusts and pure chaos. And no one stopped them. Not because adults didn't care, but because they were busy eating, drinking, avoiding eye contact with their in-laws. In the absence of structured play or toys, kids got creative. They raced sticks down puddles, threw mud balls at chickens, dared each other to touch the priest's donkey. They used turnips as projectiles and haystacks as crash mats. At least one child always ended up in the stew pot. Not in it, thankfully, but close enough to raise questions. Toddlers toddled directly into the ceremony. Babies were strapped to hips or simply plopped onto the ground like satchels. A child would cry every 5 minutes, either because they tripped, were bitten by another child, or had their only snack stolen by a passing dog. No one panicked, This was normal. The bride and groom often ignored the madness. Occasionally, the bride would grab a toddler by the collar mid-vow and hand them off to someone with "Here, yours now." The child, unfazed, would simply scurry off like a tiny medieval gremlin. Sometimes there was a group of older kids, self-declared supervisors, who lorded over the little ones with all the compassion of tiny landlords. "No, you can't sit there. Yes, we're allowed to take your bread." Lord of the Flies meets dirt and bad hygiene. In truth, weddings were some of the only times children were allowed, even encouraged, to be completely wild. It was understood. Let them burn off steam while the adults did the same. If they didn't come back covered in scratches, bruises, and someone else's breadcrumbs, were they even at a wedding? By the end of the day, most children were passed out in hay piles, sticky and exhausted. A few had acquired minor injuries, but no one was surprised either. In the grand tradition of medieval peasant weddings, music was less organized performance, and more whatever sound someone could coax out of an object. If you were lucky, a local with a fiddle showed up. If you were very lucky, he knew more than one tune. The most common musician was that one guy. Every village had one who claimed he could play something. A flute, a pipe, a badly tuned lute with 3 strings and 1 dream. Sometimes the instrument was improvised. A pot lid and a stick, 2 jugs, or just enthusiastic whistling through missing teeth. If no one brought an instrument, well, congratulations. You now had a choir of ale-soaked uncles belting the one wedding song they all kind of remembered. The lyrics were vague, slightly inappropriate, and repeated until someone passed out or forgot the words, whichever came first. Drums, when present, were anything that made noise when hit. Buckets, barrels, one time, a well-fed goose in a sack. Rhythmic stomping was also a favorite, particularly useful since it doubled as dancing and scared away rats. The repertoire narrow. Most songs fell into one of 3 categories. Love songs, where someone definitely dies at the end. Drinking songs, where everyone dies at the end. Historical ballads, where everyone dies and loses their sheep. No one really cared about skill. Volume mattered more than melody. If you were loud and enthusiastic, you were a musician. If you had rhythm, you were a professional. If you could clap in time and not fall over, you were a legend. Children often joined in, adding high-pitched screeches to the mix. Dogs barked along. Occasionally, a rooster would try to solo. It was chaos, and yet, somehow, it worked. The soundscape was clumsy, off-key, occasionally alarming, but it filled the air with joy, or at least with noise, and that was enough. For peasants who rarely heard music beyond a church bell or the sound of rain on a leaking roof, this was magic. Brief, messy magic. Once the music started, and by music we mean rhythmic banging and someone whistling off-key, it was only a matter of time before the dancing began. And by dancing, we don't mean elegant waltzes or courtly steps. We mean stomping, flailing, and vaguely coordinated hopping, performed with the unhinged energy of people who had spent the last 6 months bent over in a barley field. There were no formal dances in peasant villages, no rehearsed routines. What you had was instinctual celebration, deeply chaotic, but undeniably sincere. People formed circles, lines, or something between the two and just moved. There might be clapping, slapping, shouting, and stomping, often at the same time, and rarely in rhythm. Feet pounded the earth with enough force to startle birds and churn up mud. Arms were thrown around shoulders. Backs were slapped, sometimes accidentally. The elderly clapped along, from the sidelines, cheering on anyone who managed to stay upright longer than 3 songs. Some villagers attempted fancier steps, usually the ones who had visited larger towns or heard tales from a traveling dancer who once passed through 5 years ago. These brave souls would try a spin or a leap, only to land awkwardly and pretend they meant to sit down anyway. Shoes were optional. By the second dance, most people had either kicked them off, lost them, or discovered they were slowing them down. Bare feet slapping muddy earth became the percussion section. Occasionally, someone would fall. Everyone would cheer. Falling was part of the ritual. The bride and groom were expected to participate, of course. The crowd would chant, shout encouragement, and sometimes physically shove them into the middle of the circle. They danced while blushing, laughing, or silently begging for someone else to steal the spotlight. Children joined in too, inventing their own moves, which mostly involved spinning until they fell over. One particularly bold child often started a conjure line. No one knew where they learned it. They just did. And while no one would call it graceful, the dancing was honest. It was joyful. It was peasants saying, "We're alive. We're fed. We're together. Let's move." If music was optional and dancing was improvised, ale was absolutely mandatory. No medieval peasant wedding was complete without it. And not just a pint or two. We're talking jugs, barrels, buckets, and anything else that could hold a fermented liquid without leaking too fast. Water was considered suspicious, mostly because it tended to contain unpleasant things like frogs, filth, or dysentery. Ale, on the other hand, had been boiled during brewing, which made it safer and far more entertaining. It wasn't always strong, but it could be, depending on who brewed it and how little they valued subtlety. Most weddings featured a mix of weak ale, suitable for children and the elderly, and something stronger, which could drop a grown man in 3 cups flat. The latter was often stored in large wooden casks and ladled out like soup. You didn't ask what was in it. You just drank it and hoped you remembered the rest of the evening. Mugs were passed around freely. If you had your own, great. If not, you shared. No one worried about germs, mostly because the concept of germs hadn't been invented yet, and also because ale felt clean. That tingly, burning sensation. That was the sanitizing effect, they said, or possibly blindness. With each round, the crowd got louder, looser, and a bit more chaotic. Polite laughter gave way to belly laughs. Stories became more exaggerated. People started complimenting the bride's smile or the groom's oddly shaped knees. Someone always started a drinking song, which turned into a shouting contest, which then turned into a nap under the table. There was always one person who shouldn't have had that last cup. The kind who began by singing and ended by vomiting behind a haystack. And yet no one judged. That was just part of the ritual. In a world of hard labor, harsh winters, and looming mortality, ale was more than just a beverage. It was social glue. It made people talk, laugh, confess, and occasionally fall into a trough. And at a wedding, it served one essential purpose: to turn a sacred union into a party no one would remember clearly, but everyone would remember fondly. No medieval peasant wedding was complete without a touch of chaos. Not necessarily planned chaos, but the kind that simmers under the surface until someone's elbow nudges the wrong jug or someone else flirts with the wrong cousin. Let's start with the flirtations. Weddings were matchmaking gold mines. You had music, drink, food, technically, and a field full of eligible peasants who had spent the past several months covered in mud and despair. A wedding offered the rare chance to see someone without soot on their face. It was basically medieval speed dating. Glances were exchanged. Flowers were awkwardly offered. A few brave souls attempted poetry, which usually involved rhyming hay with May and quickly losing their nerve. The dance floor was prime flirting territory, though most moves involved tripping into someone and pretending it was romantic. Of course, not all flirtations were welcome, and that's where the fights began. The most common triggers. Someone danced too closely with someone else's intended. Someone spilled ale on a borrowed tunic. Someone insulted someone's goat. Again, the fights were rarely serious, mostly shoving, slurred shouting, and the occasional wrestling match in the mud that no one actually tried to break up. By the time it ended, both parties were usually too tired or too drunk to remember what they were arguing about. They'd shake hands, share a mug, and move on. Then there were the accidents. Weddings plus livestock plus ale equals unpredictable results. Chickens were frequently stepped on. Children fell into barrels. Someone always tripped into the stew pot. Once, a goat got tangled in the bride's veil and dragged her 10 feet before anyone noticed. She was fine. The goat was applauded, but no one was surprised. Accidents were part of the fun. They gave the villagers stories to tell for years to come. Remember Thomas's wedding when old Magda sat on the beehive? Instant legend. And while nobles had pristine banquets and rehearsed toasts, peasants had spilled ale, accidental kisses, and mild head injuries. And somehow that felt more genuine. At some point in every medieval peasant wedding, right after the fourth drinking song, but before the goat stole the bread, someone would look around and ask the question, "Hey, where'd the bride and groom go?" Cue the knowing smirks, the raised eyebrows, the older aunties nudging each other and muttering things like, "Well, they didn't waste time." Because everyone knew exactly where the newlyweds were, or at least what they were doing. Consummation wasn't just tradition. It was legally important. In medieval Christian Europe, a marriage wasn't considered fully valid until it was, let's say, made official in the eyes of the Lord and a sagging straw mattress. Technically, some weddings even had witnesses. A disturbing mix of custom and nosiness, though by the later Middle Ages, most villages wisely abandoned that part. The newlyweds usually slipped away to a barn or a back room or a hoft. Someone had swept for the occasion. Privacy was relative. There were no locks and curtains were a luxury. But the important thing was symbolic disappearance. The community understood. Let them vanish. Let them bond. Meanwhile, back at the feast, the party carried on. The absence of the couple didn't stop the dancing or the ale or the off-key singing. If anything, it gave people something to gossip about. How long do you think they'll be gone? Betty trips over his own boots. She looked like she knew what she was doing. Well, his mother said he's clumsy. When the couple eventually reappeared, flushed, rumpled, vaguely victorious, no one said anything out loud, but everyone looked. The groom got handshakes. The bride got proud nods and unsolicited advice from women who'd been married since the great turnip shortage of 1314. Some couples didn't return at all. They fell asleep in the hay or decided that right now was a good time to start that domestic bliss early. No one blamed them. After months of labor and years of waiting, they'd earned their brief escape from noise, mud, and neighbors who couldn't stop commenting. And while there were no honeymoons, that stolen hour of privacy was the closest thing they'd ever get. The morning after a medieval peasant wedding was less romantic sunrise and more hangover with livestock. Gone were the music, laughter, and frantic goat chasing. In their place, aching feet, empty jugs, and the slow communal realization that someone had definitely slept in a cabbage patch. Guests emerged from wherever they'd collapsed, haystacks under carts, inside sheds, or simply curled up next to the communal fire like large snoring cats. Hair was matted, tunics were muddy. One man was wearing someone else's cloak and didn't seem particularly eager to give it back. The feast table, if you could call it that, was now a war zone. Half-eaten loaves, spilled ale, an overturned stew pot, and the unmistakable presence of a chicken that had clearly been there all night. Someone found a single shoe in a tree. Someone else had acquired a dog. Children were already up, of course, wide awake and sticky, dragging sticks and singing fragments of the wedding song with lyrics they'd invented. One toddler walked past proudly holding a goose egg, and no one knew where he got it or if the goose was okay. The bride and groom likely still hiding. They'd resurface eventually, tasseled, exhausted, and probably with straw in their hair, ready to begin a new life of shared chores, livestock maintenance, and mild existential dread. But on this morning, they were allowed to remain mythical figures. Those with stronger stomachs helped clean. Bread crusts were salvaged, mugs stacked, barrels rolled. Others simply sat on logs, holding their heads and muttering prayers for silence, strong tea, or time travel. The priest walked by with a suspiciously smug look. He hadn't partied. He remembered everything. And, worse, he was ready to talk about it. Yet, despite the mess, no one complained. There was a quiet satisfaction in the aftermath. The wedding had happened. The couple was married. The village had come together, danced, eaten, bled a little, and survived. That was enough. When you picture a medieval wedding, it's tempting to imagine elegance. Flower garlands, flowing gowns, sweet music wafting through the trees, and that might have happened somewhere. But for peasants, the real legacy of a wedding was much simpler. It was mud, laughter, bruised knees, boiled cabbage, and community. These weddings weren't about prestige. They weren't spectacles meant to impress. There were no photographers, no planners, no mood boards. What there was, and what mattered, was presence. The whole village came out, not just to witness the vows, but to participate in something rare. Joy. Because medieval life for peasants wasn't just hard, it was relentless. Hunger, disease, taxes, bad weather, and the occasional armed noble crashing through your barley field. Joy was brief. Fun was suspect. But weddings were the exception, a communal pause in the chaos, a moment where dirt-stained hands held bread instead of tools, and voices sang instead of swearing at rocks. Even if the stew was bland, the ale ran out, or someone got kicked by a donkey, it didn't matter. What mattered was that the village gathered to say, "These two people now face the world together. Let's all shout and spill things in their honor." And so, the legacy of the peasant wedding wasn't captured in stained glass or chronicled in illuminated manuscripts. It lived on in stories told over bread fires, in the song hummed during the next harvest, in the smile between a couple sharing stew months later, now with calloused hands and shared debt. It was in the mud stray, the goose-related injuries, the whispered gossip that somehow became legend. It was real. It was messy. And it belonged to the people. And if the world ended tomorrow, as it occasionally tried to do in the Middle Ages, the villagers would at least have this memory. A day when life felt lighter, when no one worked, and when two people said yes to each other while chickens clucked disapprovingly nearby. Before the wine was poured or the lyre was plucked, there were rules, lots of them. Despite the chaos and laughter later in the night, the Greek symposium was not some mindless frat party. It was ritualized, exclusive, and strangely sacred. You didn't just show up and start drinking. No, that would have been barbaric. First, you had to be invited. The host, known as the symposia, carefully curated the guest list. This was an all-male affair. Free-born men only. Slaves they served. Women-only courtesans or Haiti were allowed inside. Wives stayed home. The evening began with a meal. The dapanon, where everyone would eat reclining on couches, heads propped up on cushions like relaxed philosophers. This wasn't the symposium proper. This was the warm-up. No alcohol yet. That came after. Because once the food was cleared and the floor swept, the real event began. The wine was mixed with water in a large crater. To drink wine unmixed, as the Scythians did, was considered univilized. The symposiac decided the ratio. Weak, you're here for conversation. Strong, you're here for chaos. It was a fine line, too, and things stayed stiff. Too drunk, and Plato's dialogues turned into a Dionysian disaster. Now here's where it gets interesting. Every symposium had a purpose, usually philosophical, political, or poetic. But underlying all that was a sense of sacred leisure, what the Greeks called scholar. This wasn't wasted time. It was where ideas were born, where young aristocrats sharpened their minds, played verbal games, composed impromptu poetry, and maybe, just maybe, fell in love. Before the debate started, libations were poured to Dionysus, the god of wine and divine madness. There was singing, sometimes by hired musicians, sometimes by the guests themselves. A flute girl might play, a courtesan might challenge a guest to a riddle, but everything was structured. The wine passed clockwise. Each round came with a toast. Drinking too fast was frowned upon. Getting sloppy was shameful. The ideal guest, witty, graceful, and just drunk enough to tell the truth beautifully. In the end, the symposium was a performance, a place where men proved their intellect as much as their tolerance for wine. It was a dance between reason and indulgence. And if you broke the rules, you weren't just embarrassing yourself, you were insulting the very spirit of the gathering. The physical setting of a symposium was no accident. It was a stage for both mind and body to perform. The event typically took place in a specially designed room in the Greek household called the andron, reserved solely for men. It was a square space lined with couches or clean-eye, each wide enough for a man to recline on his side while propped up on one elbow. The center was left open, perfect for servants to pour wine, dancers to perform, or for the occasional impromptu game involving tossing wine leaves at a target. Yes, they had drinking games too. Light came from flickering oil lamps, and the air was thick with the scent of burning incense, roasted meats, and the occasional perfume worn by courtesans. It was intimate, sensual, and designed to lower inhibitions without erasing the intellect. The couches were arranged in a circle, encouraging eye contact, verbal sparring, and shared laughter. This wasn't just architecture, it was psychology. Everyone had equal status here. No one sat at the head of a table. No one was above another. This spatial equality fostered philosophical democracy, an egalitarian moment in a deeply hierarchical world. The mood could shift dramatically, depending on the host and the mix of guests. Some symposia were political strategy sessions disguised as drinking parties. Others devolved into singing contests and naked dancing. And some, like the one described in Plato's Symposium, were lofty, abstract, and almost religious in tone. But they all began in the same place with a shared space, a shared drink, and a shared sense that something important was about to happen. Even the decor mattered. Walls were often adorned with mythological paintings. Hercules feasting with the gods, Dionysus leading his drunken revelers, satyrs chasing nymphs. These were not just pretty images. They were reminders of the thin veil between civilization and ecstatic chaos. They whispered, "This is play, but it's sacred play. And let's not forget the wine itself, served in decorated cups, kai-likes. These often had erotic or comic scenes painted at the bottom, slowly revealed as the drinker emptied his cup. The moment of draining your drink came with a laugh, a blush, or a clever comment, depending on who was watching. At the heart of many symposia was a dynamic that still baffles and fascinates modern minds. The paiderastia relationship between an older man, the Arises, and a younger male beloved, the Aramos. This wasn't just tolerated, it was idealized. The older man was the teacher, the lover, the sponsor of intellect and refinement. The younger man, usually a teenage boy of aristocratic birth, was the student and the object of admiration, and the symposium was their theater. This bond wasn't purely carnal, at least not in theory. It was supposed to be about virtue, discipline, and the passing down of knowledge and moral character. But that didn't stop the air in the symposium from becoming charged with erotic tension. The older men would use clever wordplay and recited poetry to woo the beautiful youths reclining beside them. Compliments were expected. Groping was frowned upon. The key was restraint. It proved control, dignity, and the seriousness of one's intent. The beloved, meanwhile, was expected to resist, at least publicly. His virtue lay in how well he could deflect advances with grace and wit. A boy who gave in too easily lost social value. A boy who refused everyone forever risked seeming cold or arrogant. The ideal kept everyone guessing. He blushed, he deflected, he teased, and above all, he listened. He was expected to absorb not just affection, but wisdom. Now, not every guest engaged in these dynamics. Married men were supposed to behave, but let's be honest, many didn't. Courtesans and heterae were allowed to offer physical pleasure, but the boys were meant to offer something higher, inspiration. They were the muses of the male elite. Their youth reminded older men of fleeting beauty, of time's cruel advance, of why philosophy mattered in the first place. Plato famously used a symposium to explore the nature of love itself as a ladder beginning with physical attraction and rising toward divine contemplation. But that lofty climb began quite literally on a couch beside a beautiful boy. The intimacy of the setting made it possible to speak of the soul without embarrassment, to admit longing without shame. Wine was not just a beverage at the symposium. It was the fuel, the compass, and the test. But the Greeks didn't drink the way we do today. To them, consuming wine unmixed with water was considered the mark of a savage. The ideal Greek drinker diluted his wine with at least 3 parts water. Why? Because wine was not meant to overwhelm. It was meant to loosen the tongue without dulling the mind. The central crater, a large mixing vessel, sat in the middle of the room like an altar. The symposia, often elected for the evening, decided the wine-to-water ratio. He wielded great power. A strong mix meant a wild night. A weak one signaled a night of poetry and discourse. It was a delicate balance, too, and the evening dragged. Too drunk and you might vomit on your neighbor's sandals and earn eternal shame. Each guest was given a cup, often beautifully painted, and the wine was ladled out in rounds. It flowed clockwise, with each man taking a sip before passing it on. But it wasn't just about drinking, it was about rhythm. Each round came with a toast, a song, a witty remark. Wine invited vulnerability, creativity, and occasionally madness. The Greeks believed Dionysus, god of wine, could inspire both divine insight and complete insanity, depending on how much you poured, and pour they did, but not without purpose. There was an art to pacing oneself. A truly respectable guest could drink several rounds, trade clever jabs, recite Homer, and still sit upright. Losing control. That was for barbarians. In fact, the symposium was partly a training ground to show that a real man could enjoy pleasure and still govern himself. Self-control, even in intoxication, was a virtue. That said, not all guests adhered to the ideal. The drunk who danced naked, knocked over the lyre player, or mistook the serving boy for a sada became the subject of ridicule for years. Stories of symposium disasters were passed around like cautionary tales, but on the flip side, the slightly tipsy philosopher who spoke beautifully on the nature of justice or love might be remembered for eternity. Not every moment at a symposium was philosophical pondering. When the wine flowed and minds loosened, the Greeks turned to games and music, deliberate structured amusements that revealed a man's spirit, cleverness, and social finesse. The symposium wasn't just a place for intellectual showmanship, it was a playground for performance. One of the most popular games was Cotter Boss, a bizarre and surprisingly elegant pastime. Guests would flick the dregs of their wine at a target, often a saucer balanced on a stand or floating in a bowl of water, trying to knock it over with a well-aimed splash. Success wasn't just about skill, it was symbolic. Men often called out the name of a lover while launching their wine. A cheeky blend of flirtation and athleticism. Hit the mark. The gods approved your passion. Miss well, maybe you weren't worthy of her or him. Music was ever present. A hired flute girl, Alatric might play haunting tunes to accompany a toast or dance between courses. Sometimes she danced herself, swirling in rhythm with the rising heat of the evening. But the guests didn't just listen. They performed, reciting Homer, improvising erotic poetry, or singing drinking songs was not optional. It was expected. A man who couldn't carry a tune or deliver a clever verse was silently judged, even pied. But the real performance was verbal. Witty banter, sympathetic conversation, was an art form. Verbal duels tested memory, wordplay, philosophical knowledge, and charm. Men would pose riddles, challenge each other to poetic improvisation, or tell biting jokes. It wasn't about cruelty. It was about finesse. The best conversationalist was quick, thoughtful, and slightly provocative. And then there were the riddles, sometimes philosophical, sometimes obscene. A well-timed riddle could silence a room or send it into raucous laughter. The most admired guests could deliver a dirty pun and a theory of justice in the same breath. And if the room was right, if the wine was balanced and the company sharp, the entire event took on a magical atmosphere, half performance, half revelation. The goal of it all wasn't just to impress, it was to connect, to build bonds, to let personality, intellect, and desire intertwine. In this playful chaos, reputations were made or destroyed. Because in the Greek symposium, you weren't just judged by what you thought, but by how cleverly you could say it while half drunk and draped in a tunic. While Greek wives stayed behind closed doors, barred from the intellectual and sensual world of the symposium, another kind of woman moved freely through the flickering lamplight. Hitarai. These high-class courtesans were not mere entertainers or sex workers. They were educated, witty, and trained in music, conversation, and seduction. They weren't just present at the symposium, they were vital to it. A hatra could recite poetry, sing alongside the lyre, debate philosophical ideas, and outflirt even the cleverest aristocrat. Unlike most Greek women, she was not confined to the household. She could own property, attend parties, and even accumulate wealth. Some became legendary, like Aspasia, the famed partner of Pericles, who was rumored to have taught rhetoric to Athens' greatest minds. But make no mistake, their position was complex. They walked a thin line between celebrated and scorned. Revered for their intellect and charm, they were also objects of lust and satire. Still, in the wine-soaked world of the symposium, the hatra was often the only woman who could speak freely and be heard. Their presence changed the dynamic. With them, the evening was no longer just a boys' club of philosophy and flirting. It became a charged, unpredictable dance of power and performance. A well-placed remark from a hetaira could deflate a man's ego or spark a debate that lasted all night. They were conversational warriors trained to challenge, tease, and occasionally humiliate. Eroticism was always in the air, but it wasn't always consummated. The flirtation, the tension, that was the point. Some heterae were lovers. Others remained distant, using allure as leverage. They played by their own rules, often using their beauty and wit to climb socially or manipulate political alliances. For many men, these women represented a fantasy: female companionship without domestic duty, sensuality without obedience, intellect without inhibition. They were free in a way that Greek wives could never be, and that made them both intoxicating and dangerous. In a room designed for male pleasure, the heterae were a reminder that true control was never fully in male hands. They could ruin a joke, redirect a debate, or inspire a poem that would be remembered for generations. In a culture obsessed with power and performance, they were masters of both. While the symposium had its fair share of games, flirtation, and poetic excess, its greatest legacy may be intellectual. Beneath the laughter and rising intoxication, something remarkable happened. Serious thought took root. These were not mere drinking parties. They were laboratories of the mind. Somewhere between the third cup of wine and the last riddle, the guests often launched into debates that would shape Western philosophy forever. The most famous example, of course, is Plato's Symposium, a fictionalized account of a real gathering where Socrates, Alcibiades, Aristophanes, and others explored the nature of love. But this wasn't an isolated event. Across Greece, especially in Athens, symposiums were known as places where ideas collided. Public issues, metaphysics, morality, and human desire were all on the menu. These debates weren't lectures. They were battles of logic, of wit, of emotional conviction. The setting mattered. Wine lowered defenses, humor softened blows, and the intimate space gave permission for vulnerability. You could challenge a man's view on justice, his belief in the gods, or even his sexual preferences, and if you were clever enough, earn his respect. One of the central themes was erotic love, not just in the carnal sense, but as a philosophical force. Socrates, through Plato, described love as a ladder. It starts with physical attraction, rises through appreciation of beauty, and culminates in the contemplation of the eternal form of beauty itself. That idea, it was born at a symposium. But other topics came up too. What is virtue? What makes a man wise? Can the soul be immortal? Is pleasure a good in itself, or merely a distraction? These were not academic questions. They were urgent, personal, and delivered in between sips of spiced wine. It's no coincidence that many of the great thinkers of Greece, Socrates, Plato, Xenophon, frequented symposia. These events were incubators of thought. They offered a rare combination: leisure, intellect, sensuality, and challenge. And unlike public forums, the symposium allowed for nuance. You could speak freely, revise your opinions mid-sentence, or offer an idea half-formed and see where it went. For all their intellectual ambition and poetic charm, symposia could, and often did, spiral into chaos. While philosophers dreamed of truth and beauty, reality had a habit of barging in, wine-soaked and staggering. The symposium's tightrope walk between order and indulgence didn't always end well, and when it failed spectacularly. Take Alcibiades, for example, the handsome, brilliant, and deeply scandalous Athenian statesman. He famously crashed the symposium in Plato's dialogue, already drunk, crowned with ivy like Dionysus himself. Instead of offering a sober reflection on love, he gave a wildly personal and sexually charged speech about Socrates. It was funny, emotional, and borderline inappropriate. The line between admiration and desire blurred, and what was meant to be a noble evening turned into an unfiltered outpouring of drunken obsession. But Alcibiades' antics weren't just awkward, they were prophetic. He would go on to betray Athens, flee to Sparta, switch sides again, and die in exile. His love of wine, performance, and recklessness mirrored the dark side of the symposium culture. Charm without restraint, brilliance without ethics, and he wasn't alone. Many political scandals had their roots in symposia. Gossip spread quickly. Who flirted too boldly? Who got too drunk? Who insulted a guest or blasphemed a god in the haze of wine? It was all noted, whispered, and weaponized. A misstep in a private symposium could ruin a public career. Symposia also became associated with decadence, especially in later periods. As Athens declined and Rome rose, the original balance of intellect and indulgence tilted dangerously toward pure hedonism. Wine was no longer watered down. Guests competed in gluttony instead of poetry. The flute girls outnumbered the philosophers, and what was once sacred play became cynical performance. Even the Spartans, famously austere, mocked Athenian symposia as soft, effeminate, and corrupt. To them, the very idea of reclining on couches, debating love while sipping diluted wine, seemed like a recipe for moral decay. And in some ways, it was. Yet the Greeks were aware of the risks. That's why moderation was so prized. A man who could keep his dignity while drunk, charm without seducing, and argue without humiliating, was the true hero of the symposium. Long after the last crater was emptied and the last lyre note faded, the Greek symposium left behind something far more enduring than a hangover. A legacy of intellectual culture that still shapes how we think, talk, and connect today. What began as a structured drinking party became one of history's most unlikely engines of philosophy, art, and social development. The symposium offered a radical idea, especially for its time, that leisure wasn't merely idleness, it was sacred space. Skolola, the Greek word for leisure, is the root of our word school. That's no accident. The symposium turned leisure into a crucible for learning. It proved that wisdom didn't have to come from temples or classrooms alone. It could emerge amid wine, laughter, flirtation, and flamelit debate. Plato's Symposium is the most famous relic of this world, and its impact is hard to overstate. It gave us not just a model of structured philosophical dialogue, but enduring concepts like Platonic love, the ladder of Eros, and the idea that beauty and truth are intimately connected. The format of that work, men reclining, drinking, and riffing on a shared theme, would become the prototype for everything from university seminars to late-night salons. The Romans inherited the symposium and transformed it into the convivium, a more lavish, less philosophical affair. But the structure remained. Medieval and Renaissance thinkers reawakened the spirit of the symposium in their own salons, circles, and societies. And even today, we carry echoes of it. The dinner party that turns into a deep conversation at midnight, the book club that spends more time on existential questions than the actual book, the podcast where two minds drink, laugh, and dissect reality. Even the symposium's flaws have left their mark. The gender exclusivity, the hierarchies of beauty and age, the danger of excess, all remain relevant as cautionary tales in how communities are built and broken. But perhaps its greatest gift was the idea that pleasure and thinking need not be at odds, that beauty, desire, humor, and intellect could all share a single room, that truth could be seduced, not just reasoned. In the end, the Greek symposium wasn't just where philosophy met pleasure. It was where civilization discovered that the mind, the body, and the spirit all need a place to play. And in that sacred, wine-slicked space, the Western world learned how to talk. Imagine walking through the streets of ancient Thebes or Memphis. The heat radiates off the limestone, and the air smells of incense, lotus, and palm wine. But what grabs your attention isn't the temples or the towering obelisks. It's the people, men and women alike. Their faces adorned with thick black eyeliner that extends dramatically from the corners of their eyes. Their heads are crowned not with natural hair, but with ornate wigs, braided, curled, sometimes perfumed. It's striking, unmistakable, and absolutely everywhere. In ancient Egypt, personal appearance wasn't just a matter of vanity. It was a coded language. What you wore on your head and painted around your eyes told the world who you were, what you believed, and where you stood in society. Wigs and eyeliner weren't mere trends. They were statements of identity, spirituality, and hygiene. Eyeliner made from a dark green pigment called malachite, or the more famous coal from galena, a black lead sulfide, was applied with careful precision. The look was bold, but not just for beauty. It was believed to protect the eyes from harsh sunlight, much like how athletes today use black grease. More importantly, it had deep spiritual and medicinal significance. The ancient Egyptians believed the pigment protected against evil spirits and infections, especially from the Nile's ever-present flies and bacteria. This wasn't superstition alone. Modern science has confirmed that lead-based coal may have had antimicrobial properties. So, yes, your eyeliner could save your life. As for the wigs, they were more than fashionable headpieces. Hair was shaved regularly to maintain cleanliness and prevent lice. Wigs were worn daily by elites and on special occasions by commoners. The material varied: wool, plant fiber, or human hair, and so did the complexity. Some were simple plaits, others towering structures of curls, beads, and even gold ornaments. A well-made wig was expensive and a symbol of wealth, much like a tailored suit or luxury handbag today. Together, the wig and the eyeliner created a persona, controlled, composed, and sacred. To appear in public without them, especially in the upper classes, would be unthinkable. It wasn't just about looking good. It was about being civilized, clean, protected, and in harmony with the gods. To ancient Egyptians, kohl wasn't just makeup. It was protection, identity, and even a kind of prayer. Both men and women, rich and poor, lined their eyes with bold strokes of black, stretching the pigment out toward the temples in elegant, sweeping arcs. And they didn't do it because it looked cool, though it absolutely did. They did it because the eyes were sacred. The ancient word for eye makeup was med, and applying it was an almost ritual act. The most common formula was made from galena, a dark gray mineral ground into fine powder and mixed with oils or animal fat. Applied with a stick, it formed that iconic black eyeliner that defined Egyptian faces for centuries. But there was more to it than aesthetics. Galena was thought to repel illness and misfortune. It wasn't just paint, it was magic. Why the obsession with the eyes? Because in Egyptian mythology, the eye had power. The eye of Horus, one of the most enduring symbols of protection and royal authority, represented healing and wholeness. To line one's eyes with kohl was to invoke this protective symbol to spiritually and physically shield oneself from harm. And protection was no small matter in the ancient world. The Nile, while the giver of life, also brought disease and pests, flies, dust, bacteria. These were everyday concerns. Kohl may have acted as an early form of sunscreen and an antimicrobial barrier. Archaeologists even found that the lead salts in kohl stimulated nitric oxide production in the skin, which helps the immune system. So, in a very real sense, it healed while it decorated. But the use of kohl wasn't the same for everyone. The wealthy had access to finely milled galena and decorative applicators made from ivory or polished wood. Poorer citizens might use simpler versions or crushed charcoal. But the impulse to adorn and protect the eyes transcended glass. Even laborers could be found with lined eyes, their own form of everyday sacredness. Interestingly, the act of painting one's eyes was deeply sensual and not just in the modern cosmetic sense. It was intimate. To prepare your eyes for the world meant preparing your soul. It was a connection to the divine, the hygienic, and the erotic, all traced along the lash line. In ancient Egypt, your hair, or more precisely, your wig, told people everything they needed to know about you. Who you were, how clean you were, how rich you were, how close to the gods you stood. Wigs weren't just